There is one habit, one ancient elemental practice that can rewire your brain, reshape your character, and forge a discipline so resilient, it becomes indistinguishable from your identity. It is not glamorous. It does not entertain the ego, but it works. It's cold exposure. E. Stepping into cold water willingly daily. And here's why this matters more than you think. Every time you face the cold, truly face it, you make a declaration to your nervous system. I am in control. You signal to the primitive circuits of the brain, the amygdala, the limbic system, that comfort is not your master. You override thousands of years of evolutionary wiring that says, avoid pain, seek ease, and in doing so, you wake up the highest part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, that says, we don't live by instinct, we live by intention. Cold exposure isn't about toughness for toughness' sake. It's about building the capacity to act despite resistance. It taps into the same neurochemical systems that govern addiction, motivation, and focus, dopamine, norepinephrine, endorphins, and teaches them a new pattern, that reward comes after effort, not before. This habit, simple as it sounds, flips your entire reward system. It trains you to chase discomfort in service of growth, to crave challenge, to love the edge. It separates those who wait for motivation from those who create it chemically, neurologically, spiritually every morning. Here's what happens over time. The things that used to derail you, procrastination, fatigue, emotional spirals, they lose their grip. Your stress response becomes more adaptive. You don't panic under pressure, you perform, because you've trained your nervous system to stay present in discomfort. You've told your body, this is not a threat. This is training. Discipline is not a trait you're born with. It's not a switch you flip. It's a muscle, biological, neural, spiritual, that you build through reps of discomfort. And every cold plunge, every moment you choose what is hard over what is easy, is a sacred rep. There is divinity in the deliberate act of struggle. There is grace in the moment you decide to do what your mind screams against. That is where you meet the version of yourself you've only dreamed of. That is where transformation begins. Not in thought, not in feeling, but in action. If you want to rewire your brain for unstoppable discipline, you don't need 1,000 hacks. You need one habit, practice daily with reverence and resolve. Step into the cold, stay there, breathe, and listen. Not to the fear, but to the future version of you, forged in that very fire. Because once you make peace with the cold, you'll never be at war with your potential again. Daily cold exposure in its most basic form, stepping into a cold shower, plunging into icy water, or exposing the body to the chill of early morning air, is a controlled encounter with discomfort that activates deeply rooted survival circuits in the brain and body. What makes this simple habit so profound is not just the physical sensation, but the neurobiological response it provokes. When the body is suddenly subjected to cold, the sympathetic nervous system is activated, leading to a surge in adrenaline and noradrenaline. This isn't just about being alert. This is the biological equivalent of the body turning on all systems, sharpening attention, elevating heart rate, and preparing the organism for adaptive response. It is a full spectrum wake-up call that primes the mind for action. More significantly, cold exposure triggers a rapid but controlled increase in dopamine, a key neuromodulator tied to motivation, drive, and reward. Unlike the spike from a sugary snack or a fleeting digital reward, the dopamine released from cold exposure unfolds more slowly and lasts longer, creating a steady, elevated baseline. This shift stabilizes the reward system, pulling it away from compulsive seeking behavior and anchoring it in effort-based fulfillment. Over time, this trains the brain to crave challenge, not escape it. The implications for discipline are tremendous. Discipline is not merely about suppressing desires or pushing through laziness. It's about reshaping what the brain perceives as desirable. Cold exposure does precisely that. It rewires the internal system of preference. The person who steps into cold water daily is not just enduring hardship. They are learning to associate purpose with pain, to see meaning in the resistance, and to build a craving for growth through discomfort. This is mental trickery. It's a literal reorganization of neural circuitry, a sculpting of the mind toward resilience. At the level of the nervous system, this daily act builds what is called a top-down control, the capacity of the prefrontal cortex to override the reflexive responses of the limbic system. The limbic system says, Avoid this. It's uncomfortable. But the prefrontal cortex, when engaged repeatedly in deliberate cold exposure, says, we can do this. This is part of the mission. That repetition strengthens neural pathways responsible for focus, self-regulation, and delayed gratification. Over time, the brain becomes better at making intentional choices rather than reactive ones, even outside the context of the cold. This translates directly into habits, productivity, emotional regulation, and overall discipline in daily life. What cold exposure also provides is a daily visceral reference point for struggle. It becomes a mirror, an unfiltered moment that reveals how you relate to adversity. Are you tense, panicked, avoidant, or do you breathe, anchor, endure? These responses bleed into every other part of life. Bon, the person who meets cold with calm, eventually meets chaos with clarity. The training effect is not abstract, it is hardwired. Neuroplasticity is greatest when paired with urgency and focused attention, both of which are naturally induced during cold exposure. This is how cold becomes a catalyst not only for mental resilience, but also for identity change. Furthermore, cold resets the stress response system. By exposing yourself voluntarily to a non-damaging form of physical stress, you build hormetic tolerance, meaning the system becomes less reactive to everyday challenges. Traffic, criticism, uncertainty, these no longer provoke the same internal chaos. You've taught your body to stay steady under strain. This is emotional immunity. This is inner armor. And perhaps most powerfully, daily cold exposure affirms one vital truth each day. You do hard things by choice. That decision echoes throughout the rest of the day. The meeting you don't want to attend, the workout you're dreading, the conversation you've been putting off, all become approachable because you've already done the hardest thing this morning. You walked into discomfort and did not flinch. That is not just habit. That is transformation in action. The dopamine system is the engine behind motivation, drive, and reward. It's not just about pleasure. It governs what we pursue, how intensely we pursue it, and how fulfilled we feel after achieving it. But in today's world, the dopamine system is under siege. Endless notifications, sugary foods, constant entertainment, and instant gratification hijack the natural rhythms of dopamine, causing it to spike and crash repeatedly throughout the day. This leads to dysregulation where baseline dopamine levels drop, motivation flattens, and the pursuit of meaningful goals feels dull, lifeless, or overwhelming. The nervous system begins to expect reward without effort, craving stimulation rather than purpose. Cold exposure resets this broken circuitry in a powerful and deeply biological way. When the body is immersed in cold, it reacts with a surge of norepinephrine and dopamine, not in response to pleasure or indulgence, but in response to challenge. The initial spike in dopamine during cold exposure is not excessive or destabilizing. In fact, the rise is gradual, significant, and long-lasting. More importantly, it doesn't come as a result of consumption, it comes from action. The dopamine released in cold exposure is tied to effort. This is a neurological retraining of the reward system, moving it away from impulsive reward seeking and toward behavior-driven, long-term satisfaction. With consistent exposure to this kind of stimulus, the brain begins to recalibrate. Baseline dopamine levels begin to rise. TRD. This is key. Baseline dopamine, not just the peak, a healthy dopamine baseline is what allows sustained motivation, emotional resilience, and delayed gratification. You're no longer chasing quick hits. You're building a system that is internally fueled by purpose, not externally manipulated by comfort. This shift radically changes how we approach discipline because discipline is no longer just about resistance. It becomes about resonance. The things that once felt boring or difficult, like focused work, workouts, deep conversations, begin to feel intrinsically rewarding. At the neurochemical level, cold exposure also encourages the brain to become more sensitive to dopamine rather than dependent on high spikes. This increased sensitivity means that smaller, more meaningful rewards begin to have a greater impact. You no longer need constant stimulation to feel alive. You begin to derive fulfillment from challenge, from contribution, from progress. That's the essence of sustainable motivation, when the brain learns to find deep reward in meaningful effort rather than shallow indulgence. This reset is not just chemical, it's behavioral. The act of choosing to step into discomfort, Knowing that it will bring you long-term reward strengthens neural circuits responsible for future planning, self-regulation, and behavioral consistency. It's training the nervous system to look past the immediate and into the purposeful. The same circuits that regulate dopamine are deeply connected to the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for executive function, focus, and goal-directed behavior. So each time you engage in cold exposure, you're not just rewiring how dopamine is produced, you're reshaping how the brain defines what is worth pursuing. This is crucial in an age where so many people feel directionless or unmotivated. The problem is rarely a lack of goals. It's a dysregulated dopamine system that has been conditioned to crave novelty over depth, immediacy over endurance. Cold exposure flips that conditioning. It trains the brain to slow down, stabilize, and align with values over impulses. It gives you the neurochemical foundation to pursue long-term goals with clarity and grit. Cold exposure becomes a daily ritual not only of resilience, but of reward recalibration. It teaches the nervous system that true reward lives on the other side of struggle. And over time, this principle begins to apply to everything: work, relationships, health, and purpose. The dopamine system becomes a tool of focus rather than distraction. And that shift is nothing less than a revolution in how we show up in the world. The prefrontal cortex is the most evolved and uniquely human part of the brain. It governs our highest capacities: focus, planning, decision-making, self-control, and the ability to pursue long-term goals. It is the seat of discipline, willpower, and conscious action. But in order for the prefrontal cortex to lead, it must be trained. It must be consistently activated in moments when the primitive brain, the limbic system, wants to take control. And this training doesn't come through ease or routine comfort. It comes through friction, challenge, and deliberate override of reflexive behavior. Cold exposure is one of the most effective tools for this. When you step into cold water, your body reacts instantly with a stress response. The amygdala and other subcortical structures scream for you to escape. Breathing becomes shallow, heart rate spikes, muscles contract. These are primal survival circuits being activated. And yet, if you consciously choose to breathe through it, you force the prefrontal cortex to take command. You engage the very part of the brain that says, this is hard, but it's not harmful. Stay, endure, focus. That is not just an act of courage. It is an act of neural reinforcement. Each time you do this, you strengthen the prefrontal cortex's connections to subcortical regions. You build what neuroscientists call a top-down control. This is the ability of the rational brain to regulate the emotional and instinctive brain. It's what allows you to delay gratification, to resist temptation, to focus on what matters, even when it's not comfortable. Cold exposure is not just symbolic of this process. It is the real-time training ground where it happens. It creates a scenario where the only way to persist is to engage the part of the brain responsible for discipline. Over time, this daily challenge leads to measurable changes in brain function. Functional MRI studies have shown that with consistent exposure to controlled stressors like cold, the prefrontal cortex becomes more active and efficient. It lights up sooner, stays engaged longer, and communicates more effectively with other areas of the brain. This means that in other areas of life, when distractions appear, when impulses arise, when resistance shows up, the brain already knows what to do. It has rehearsed the override. It has practiced staying in the discomfort. The cold has become the rehearsal space for leadership under pressure. Importantly, activating the prefrontal cortex doesn't just help with resisting bad habits. It enhances your capacity to execute on good ones. When this brain region is well trained, you become better at organizing tasks, managing time, engaging in deep work, and following through on complex plans. You stop living reactively and start living with strategy. The brain is no longer scattered and pulled in 100 directions. It becomes a focused instrument of execution. Then there's something else, something even more powerful. The repeated act of engaging the prefrontal cortex in moments of adversity builds identity. You begin to see yourself not as someone who reacts, but as someone who leads. Someone who doesn't just think about discipline, but embodies it. That identity shift is what creates momentum. And momentum is what creates transformation. What cold exposure teaches you in biological terms is that the brain can be trained to choose purpose over comfort, order over chaos, and resolve over reflex. And it does this not through abstract theories, but through daily action. Every time you step into the cold and remain calm, focused, and present, you are literally sculpting the architecture of the prefrontal cortex. You are making it easier and more natural to act with discipline the next time life demands it. This is how we evolve, not by removing struggle, but by choosing to engage it, one deliberate decision at a time. Stress adaptation, or hormesis, is the process by which the body and brain become stronger, more resilient, and more capable through exposure to short-term, manageable stress. It's nature's way of building strength from strain. When a system is challenged, whether it's a muscle, an immune cell, or a neural circuit, it either breaks down or adapts when the challenge is calibrated just right, not too little and not too overwhelming. The system becomes stronger than it was before. This principle, known as hormesis, is foundational to both biological and psychological resilience. Cold exposure is one of the most direct and potent hormetic stressors available. It doesn't cause damage, but it forces the body and mind to respond to intense, uncomfortable sensations. The initial shock of cold water triggers the release of stress hormones like norepinephrine and cortisol. The heart rate rises, blood vessels constrict, and the body rapidly redirects blood flow to vital organs. From a survival standpoint, this is a full body alert, mobilization at every level. But when done deliberately and under controlled conditions, this stress doesn't harm the body. Instead, it becomes a training stimulus. It teaches the nervous system how to handle stress without falling apart. What happens over time is profound. With regular cold exposure, the autonomic nervous system becomes more flexible. The body learns how to return to a calm, balanced state more quickly after stress. This improved recovery is called enhanced vagal tone. It's a sign that the parasympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for rest, recovery, and digestion, is becoming more efficient. In real-world terms, this means that you don't stay stuck in fight or flight mode. You can face challenges and return to baseline faster. You develop what's called stress resilience, not by avoiding stress, but by practicing it wisely. Hormesis also changes the way you experience stress psychologically. When you choose to do something hard, something that triggers discomfort, you take ownership of the experience. This shifts your relationship to stress from reactive to proactive. You no longer see stress as something that happens to you. You see it as something you can shape. This sense of agency, of willingly engaging with difficulty, is a cornerstone of mental strength. It rewires the way the brain interprets pressure. What once triggered anxiety or avoidance becomes an opportunity to grow. On a cellular level, cold-induced hormesis stimulates the production of beneficial stress proteins and anti-inflammatory compounds. It activates brown fat, improves insulin sensitivity, boosts immune function, and increases mitochondrial efficiency, the power generators of the body's cells. These adaptations don't just make the body more robust. They also improve cognitive function, mood regulation, and energy levels. All of this feeds directly into a disciplined lifestyle. When the body is functioning at a higher level, it becomes easier to maintain habits, make clear decisions, and show up consistently for the things that matter. But perhaps the most important benefit of hormesis is identity-based. Each time you expose yourself to stress voluntarily, you reinforce the belief that you can handle more than you thought. This creates a self-image rooted in capability and courage. And that belief system, deeply embodied, not just intellectual, is what fuels long-term discipline. It's not just that you've survived the cold. It's that you've chosen the cold, met it with clarity, and come out stronger. You've proven to yourself over and over that stress is not your enemy. It's your ally in evolution. This kind of adaptation doesn't require hours a day. Just a few minutes of controlled discomfort, practiced consistently, changes the way your body and brain respond to everything else in life. The daily stressors, deadlines, conflict, uncertainty begin to lose their power. They no longer feel overwhelming because your system has been trained to adapt. Cold exposure becomes a metaphor and mechanism for growth. Lean into resistance, let the discomfort shape you, and trust that every intentional stressor is sculpting a more disciplined, resilient version of you. Neuroplasticity is the brain's extraordinary ability to rewire itself in response to experience. It is the process by which neurons form new connections, strengthen existing ones, and prune away what is no longer useful. This mechanism is the foundation of learning, habit formation, and long-term behavioral change. But neuroplasticity does not occur at random. It is not activated when the brain is passive or comfortable. Instead, it is most alive during states of focused attention, urgency, and challenge, especially when those challenges are paired with deliberate effort and intention. When you expose yourself to something difficult, like stepping into cold water or doing a physically demanding task that requires mental override, the brain enters a heightened state of alertness. Neuromodulators such as acetylcholine, dopamine, and norepinephrine are released, sharpening focus and signaling that what is happening is important. These chemicals act like spotlight beams, telling the brain, pay attention to the brain, this matters. This is when neuroplasticity is turned on. The challenge serves as the switch, and the effort to persist through that challenge is what ingrains the change. Cold exposure is one of the most direct and effective ways to access this state. Intensity of the cold naturally brings about a deep embodied presence. It forces you into the moment. You are not thinking about the past or the future. You are completely focused on regulating your breath, calming your body, and remaining still in discomfort. This deep presence, coupled with physical stress, creates the ideal conditions for plasticity. Your brain is being reprogrammed in real time to handle difficulty with more grace, to choose stillness over panic, and to stay focused even under duress. Neuroplasticity under challenge doesn't just shape the way you respond to cold. It generalizes. It transfers to it. When you've trained your brain to stay present and composed during one kind of stress, it becomes easier to stay composed in others: mental, emotional, social. The same circuits that fire when you endure physical challenge are used when you sit down to do deep work, when you resist a destructive urge, or when you engage in difficult conversations. The pathways of self-regulation and sustained attention become more accessible because you've practiced them in a high-stakes environment. This is how lasting change happens, not through thinking about doing the right thing, but by doing the hard thing under pressure. The repetition of this experience literally lays down new neural pathways. Myelin, a fatty insulating substance, wraps around the most frequently used circuits, making them faster and more automatic. So with time, what was once effortful becomes instinctive. The decision to act with discipline becomes less of a debate and more of a reflex. That's the gift of plasticity. It doesn't just change how you think. It changes who you are. There is a crucial timing factor to all of this. Neuroplasticity is strongest immediately after a alert state. That means what you do after a challenging event is just as important as the challenge itself. The minutes following a cold exposure, for example, are a golden window for rewiring the mind. If you use that time to anchor in positive internal dialogue, to reflect on your intention, or to visualize future disciplined behavior, the brain will be more likely to encode those changes. You are quite literally imprinting a new internal narrative while your brain is in a heightened adaptive state. This is why challenge-based practices like cold exposure are not just physical, they are deeply neurological. They place the brain in the optimal state for growth and then allow you to deliberately shape that growth through repetition and intention. Neuroplasticity under challenge is what transforms ideas into actions and actions into identity. Every time you step into a difficult experience with awareness and purpose, you are not just enduring, you are evolving. The discomfort becomes the doorway. The challenge becomes the sculptor. And the brain, ever adaptive, builds a new version of you, stronger, calmer, and more capable of living in alignment with your highest goals. Human behavior is largely driven by reward. From an early age, the brain is conditioned to seek out experiences that produce pleasure and avoid those that bring discomfort. This mechanism, while essential for survival, becomes problematic in a modern environment filled with endless instant gratification, social media, processed food, digital entertainment, constant stimulation. The brain, constantly bombarded with easy dopamine spikes, begins to associate effort with pain and ease with reward. Over time, this trains a pattern of compulsive reward seeking where action is only taken if there's an immediate payoff. Discipline erodes, focus fractures, and long-term goals feel empty or unreachable. But when you deliberately practice something like cold exposure, this system starts to change. Choosing to step into discomfort without a tangible external reward flips the motivational script. You are teaching your brain to value effort in and of itself. You are saying, this isn't about feeling good now. This is about becoming someone stronger. That act rewires the brain's reward system. Instead of chasing quick hits of dopamine, you begin to derive fulfillment from process, from challenge, from purpose. The cold gives you nothing in return. Not warmth, not pleasure, not comfort. What it offers is an invitation to meet resistance with intention. This is where transformation begins. The more often you accept that invitation, the more the brain begins to associate meaning with discipline, not with ease. You feel a deep internal shift. The satisfaction of having done something difficult by choice becomes more rewarding than the fleeting pleasure of indulgence. That is the core of purpose-driven behavior. It's action guided by meaning, not by mood. Neurochemically, this shift is anchored by changes in the way dopamine is released and interpreted. In a reward-seeking loop, dopamine spikes are tied to consumption, scrolling, snacking, avoiding, snacking, avoiding. But when you engage in effort-based activities that require conscious override, like cold exposure, dopamine becomes attached to anticipation and achievement of meaningful goals. The spikes are lower but more stable. The baseline rises. This makes it easier to stay motivated over the long term because your reward system is no longer riding a roller coaster of highs and crashes. You feel steady, clear, driven, not frantically chasing the next fix. This change also creates space for alignment. When your actions are no longer dictated by short-term pleasure, you can begin to ask better questions. What actually matters to me? What do I want to build? Who am I becoming through this process? Cold exposure and similar acts of conscious discomfort open the door to these questions because they put you in direct contact with your own willpower. In that space, free from distraction, you find that purpose is not something outside of you. It is something you choose to embody, one action at a time. This shift from reward-seeking to purpose-driven action is not a dramatic, overnight event. It happens gradually in small moments of conscious effort. Each time you resist the impulse to escape discomfort and instead lean into it with intention, you reinforce a new behavioral pathway. That pathway gets stronger. Eventually, it becomes easier to say no to distractions, to wake up early, to follow through on commitments, not because you're forcing yourself, but because you've trained your system to find reward in the pursuit of growth. Purpose is sustainable. Pleasure is not. Purpose creates clarity, direction, and identity. When you live from purpose, discipline no longer feels like deprivation. It feels like devotion. It becomes the natural expression of who you are becoming. And that, more than anything, is what cold exposure teaches. So it's not about tolerating pain for the sake of toughness. It's about learning how to shift from chasing the shallow to living from the deep. It's about becoming someone who acts not from craving, but from conviction. Mon, who doesn't wait for the reward to act, but acts because the action itself is part of something greater. Mind-body synchrony is not a poetic concept. It is a real measurable state where the mental and physical systems of the body align toward a single objective. In this state, your thoughts, emotions, nervous system, muscles, breath, and even cellular functions move together as a unified force. This synchrony is the foundation of peak performance, resilience, and discipline. When the mind and body are disconnected, actions become fragmented, distracted, and inefficient. But when they are attuned, fully present, fully engaged, your capacity for intentional living expands dramatically. And this alignment is not something that happens by accident. It is cultivated through experiences that require presence, intention, and discomfort. Cold exposure is one of the purest and most effective ways to achieve it. The moment you step into cold water, every system in the body is activated. Your skin reacts instantly. Your heart rate spikes, your breath shortens, and your brain begins to panic. All the automatic signals scream for you to escape. But in that precise moment, you have a choice not to fight the cold, but to synchronize with it. To calm the breath, to focus the mind, to regulate the body. That act, the conscious override of instinctive reaction, is the gateway to synchrony. You begin to breathe slower, not because the body wants to, but because the mind tells it to. The mind leads, the body follows. And in that harmony, something powerful happens. The cold doesn't disappear, but your relationship to it changes. You're no longer a scattered system trying to survive. You're a coherent system choosing how to respond. That coherence, repeated over time, becomes a trait. It builds into your nervous system. You begin to take this trained unity into other areas of life. The more you practice aligning the body and mind in adversity, the more you bring that alignment into stress, decision-making, focus, and discipline. When the body wants to quit a workout, but the mind keeps breathing, you stay. When anxiety rises in a difficult conversation, but you anchor your body to calm, you speak clearly. These aren't isolated acts of willpower. They are reflections of a deeper integration. These same circuits that fire in the cold, the ones that tell the body to settle, the breath to slow, the mind to stay focused, are the ones you recruit when life gets hard. They are the circuits of self-command. On a biological level, mind-body synchrony reduces internal conflict. When your thoughts and actions are out of sync, the nervous system suffers. There's tension, resistance, inefficiency. But when the brain and body communicate in real time through breath, posture, and intentional focus, the stress response becomes regulated. Synonyms: regulate. Heart rate variability improves, cortisol drops, and you move into a state of controlled readiness. You're not passive, but you're not panicked either. You are alert and anchored. This is the zone where real growth happens, physically, mentally, emotionally. This synchrony also reinforces identity. When you experience yourself as someone who can stay composed in challenge, it redefines what you believe about yourself. You stop seeing discipline as a struggle and start seeing it as your natural rhythm. There's a quiet confidence that grows when the mind no longer battles the body, but guides it. And the body no longer resists the mind, but listens to it. That internal dialogue becomes a feedback loop of strength, calm, and presence. Cold exposure strips away the noise and demands this harmony. There is no space for distraction. You can't be thinking about your phone or your to-do list. The only way to stay in the cold is to be completely in it, fully embodied, fully conscious. That's why it's such a powerful tool for training discipline. It doesn't just challenge your physical endurance, it sharpens the connection between thought and action, between breath and behavior. When that connection is strong, discipline stops being something you have to force. It becomes something you trust because you felt it, practiced it, and lived it in your body. And that kind of discipline doesn't fade. It becomes who you are. The path to unstoppable discipline is not paved with motivation or fleeting inspiration. It is forged through daily alignment of mind and body, through the deliberate choice to face discomfort with purpose. When you train your system, your breath, your thoughts, your actions to move as one, you become something few people ever become. Trustworthy to yourself. And that trust is the foundation of true freedom. Because once you've taught your brain that you can act with clarity under pressure, delay gratification, and stay rooted in purpose when every instinct wants to flee, you are no longer controlled by circumstance. You are governed by principle. So, step into the challenge. Don't wait for the conditions to be right. Don't wait for permission. Discipline is not a talent. It's a nervous system trained to obey truth over comfort. Build that system. Rewire that mind. And become the kind of person who does what is right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That is the real power. That is what transforms a habit into a destiny.